Hi, boys and girls. Do I ever have a story for you today? Our story is called The Telegram That Saved My Train. The B&O Railroad was sending out their train. It was about midnight, and the B&O train was leaving from St. Louis, and it was going to go to Cincinnati in on the east. And it was going to leave from Washington, Indiana. Now, that train was heavily loaded with passengers because in St. Louis there had been a big gathering, and all those people were getting ready to go to their homes on the East Coast, and they were all going to go via the train, the B&O train. Well, Jim, who was the fireman and the engineer who wrote the story, so all the story, through the story, he's called I. The engineer and Jim were getting ready to go out onto the main rail. You know how railroads have little sidings where trains will sit till other trains go by or while they check everything. Well, that was what was going on with that train. And all of a sudden, the engineer, he went to Jim, the fireman, and he said, "Jim, I have this bad premonition." Do you know what a premonition is? That big word means that that engineer had this terrible feeling inside that something terrible was going to happen. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't good. And he told Jim about it. Well, he and Jim were both Christian men. And Jim looked at the engineer and he said, "I think we should just kneel down right here before we take this train out on the main track and pray to God." So they did. They knelt down and they prayed, oh so earnestly, that whatever was bothering the engineer, that God would take care of it, because they certainly didn't know what it was. Well, when you have trouble, the best place to go is to God. So soon they got up from their knees and they started that engine and they started out onto that main railroad track. It was a beautiful night, just perfect. And that big train with its sleeping cars and all its passengers and baggage cars and caboose and engine and everything was speeding smoothly, gracefully almost, down along those curves, through the great big tunnels, back over grades, across fills, across bridges. You know, pretty soon they ended up in Seymour, Indiana. And the engineer said, "Well, Jim, I feel much better. You know, we've covered more than half of Indiana, and that was the worst part, the part with all the hills and the tunnels and everything. Now we have the easy part to get us to Cincinnati." So they stopped in Seymour, probably to let out passengers and to take some more on. Well, they started off again, and when they were about 5 miles until they came to Storm Creek Bridge, the engineer, looking outside, it was just about dawn. You know how dusk at night and dawn in the morning is the hardest time to see? And he looked out there. Was his eyes playing tricks on him? But sure enough, there, running as hard as he could go toward him, was an old man waving his hat frantically. Well, there was nothing the engineer could do but pull his brakes, and that train came to a screeching halt. Well, the engineer jumped out, and he ran out to that man, and he could see that he was really excited. And he said, "What is it, man?" And the older man said, "Ah, ah." Well, boys and girls, you know how trains go along two rails, and their wheels have a big indentation in them that run along those rails. Well, if you cut out a big chunk of one side of that rail and a train was coming as fast as it could go down that railroad, when that train would hit that broken rail, it could either throw the whole train off of the rails, or it could somehow unhook the cars and throw part of the train off, and hundreds of people could be killed. It was a really bad thing when there was a broken rail. "Are you a Christian, sir?" And the old farmer said, "Yes, I am." And the engineer said, "Tell me how you happen to be on this railroad track this early in the morning, right before the sun came up." And the man said, "It was really strange. We don't live far from here. And my wife and I, we aren't even up by this time generally. We were sound asleep when both of us were wakened. And as much as after looking at the clock, I wanted to just turn over and go back to sleep again, neither my wife or I could go back to sleep, which was really odd. So we got out of bed, and I got dressed, and my wife went and made some breakfast. And when I went and sat down at the kitchen table with her, and we'd had our prayers, and we started to eat, you know, there was a voice in my head that said, "Go to the railroad, go to the railroad." And as I was thinking about that, here it came again, that urgent voice, "Go to the railroad." And I jumped up from the table and I started to run to the door. And my wife said, "Where are you going?" And I turned around, he said, and I said, "Going to the railroad." "What for?" "I don't know." And she said, "Shouldn't you finish your breakfast, dear?" But before she could finish talking, that old farmer was running out the door, and the door came shut. So now you know why I'm here. The engineer, he said, "Oh, You've saved our lives. Let's kneel down right here on the railroad track in front of the engine and thank God." And that's what they did. Well, no sooner had they gotten up from the railroad track, the gentleman, the conductor that took all the tickets, he came running and he said, "What's the problem? Why have we stopped?" And the engineer said, "Come here, come look." And he showed him that big part that was missing out of the train track. And the conductor looked at it and he said, "How did you know?" And the engineer, he pointed to the farmer. The farmer explained what had happened and why he had come and how he got there and he saw the broken rail and he didn't know which way a train might be coming. So he just stood there by that broken rail. And then all of a sudden, he had heard the sound of a train coming. And then he knew which way it was coming from. And he started running. And that's when the engineer had seen him. And the conductor said, "I'm not a Christian man, but thank God that you came and saved the train." The people from the train, the employees, that is, got out and they carefully repaired as best they could that big length of rail. Now, they knew that if there was a train coming as fast as it could go through there, and if it hit that broken piece that they tried to repair, it would probably throw that train off the railroad. But the train, this train, the one that Jim and the engineer were running, when they put that back in place, they crept very, very slowly across it till they were on the other side. And then they left one of their firemen there to stop any other trains that might be coming. Well, it wasn't too long till they had gone the other half of that train ride, and they arrived in Grand Central Depot in Cincinnati. The engineer got out and he leaned against the big cylinder that was the front of the train, and he looked at the people getting off of his train. Some of them, as they came by and saw the engineer standing there, they cheerily called out to him, "Well, in spite of the delay, thank you for getting us so close to on time. Bye-bye now." And others were sober-faced, and their noses were up in the air, and they walked off to do whatever they had to do. None of them knew how close to death they had come that night. It was a couple days later that the engineer was told that there had been a train that had gone through prior to their train, that when they had hit that section of the railroad, they felt the rail break. And the train jumped, but they were able to go on. They immediately got on their radio and sent a message to the dispatcher telling him to notify Jim and the engineers trained that there was a broken rail, but they had never gotten that transmission. Nobody seemed to know why. So, boys and girls, I think if you remember back in the story, remember at the first, the engineer had a bad premonition that something was wrong, and they talked to God about it? Best place to go is to God when you think there may be trouble. And you know, God has the best telegram system in the world. He sent one of his angels and woke up that farmer and his wife. And when the farmer was sitting at the table, he sent a little voice into the farmer's head that said, "Go to the railroad, urgently go to the railroad." And that farmer listened to that little voice and went and was able to stop the train in time. And you know, the engineer wrote this sentence: Jim and I knew that it was the other message, not the one that they didn't get, that saved them. The telegram sent to us by way of heaven that saved our train. Thank you, boys and girls. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.